Welcome to Chapter 4, the overview on the American political landscape, otherwise known as demographics. Chapter 4 in the online text, Chapter 5 in the textbook. Thanks for joining me. I'm Mr. Rodman, here to take you through it. Let's start by talking about political efficacy. The idea that we believe a certain way because we're able to take part in politics. Internal efficacy says we know and understand how politics works, how the political process actually works, and we can respond to that by taking part in it, participating in some way, shape, or form, like we talked about in the last chapter. That's our internal efficacy. External efficacy is then how government responds to those actions that we take, how they respond to the citizens and what the citizens are saying that they need, want, desire, whatever. So political efficacy is that idea of producing an effect. Internal is how we're able to process that and to use that information to take part in politics. All of those things we talked about in the last chapter, in Chapter 7 or 4 and 8, looking at political participation, how we can join an interest group or join a campaign or donate to a campaign or write a letter or call into a talk show or take part in a protest. All of those things are internal efficacy, how we are able to take part in politics based on what we understand about politics and how we want to make our voices heard. And the external is how government responds to that in a crisis. How government responds to that is the external efficacy that we see here. Now, do Americans have a higher internal or external efficacy? Well, usually lower external political efficacy because we don't believe government is going to do what we want it to do. We don't have a whole lot of faith in government that it's actually going to make that happen. So a much higher internal than an external efficacy because of that, because of the little faith that we have in that process. And we see that playing out here in terms of our sense of political efficacy. This ties into that distrust we've talked about before. The idea of people don't trust government because of Watergate, because of scandal, because of corruption. Time and time again, we continue to see that people don't feel like government works and doesn't work for them because of the fact that we always see every time we hear about government, it's usually in a negative light. It's usually not in a positive one. And because it's so complicated. It's really hard for people to understand and take part in the process when it's so convoluted and so messy and so bureaucratic and so wasteful in a lot of cases. And so we see a lot of this political efficacy playing out here in terms of how we view government as a result of this. And we'll come back to this in class in terms of looking at the ideas here, but look at the trends. Remember, trend is from one point in time to another point in time. What do you see in these points of time in terms of trust, in terms of anger, in terms of wants and needs around government and how we feel about our elected officials? All of this affects our external or our internal efficacy, and ultimately is because of what government is doing or not doing in terms of its responses, that external efficacy to our demands, to our wants and needs. Now, demography is the idea that we look at in terms of studying different characteristics. I call them generalizations about people. Now, we're going to have to generalize because it doesn't mean everybody in these categories falls into these nice, neat little boxes. But what it does tell us is that we can make some generalizations about how people will vote, will act, will take action based on age and race, ethnicity, gender, education, income, regional differences, and urban versus rural, in addition, the geographical ones as well. So demography is really how we kind of study those characteristics and how we make that determination about how people are going to vote when it comes to public opinion. Now, we have two types of cleavages, basically separations between public opinion here. We have what's called a reinforcing cleavage, and this is the idea that all of the characteristics that make up a person's demography, basically reinforce the fact that they're going to vote a certain way. That's really easy for a pollster or a political scientist to look at their demographics and say, yes, this is how they will probably vote based on their characteristics. And we'll take a look at one of those here in a second. And a cross-cutting cleavage is when they don't necessarily reinforce each other. Looking at the different demographics, we can see that they don't reinforce reinforce each other, and they kind of cut across different cleavages. And so they're more of a wild card in terms of how they're going to vote. So a reinforcing cleavage would be someone who attends church, someone who lives in a rural area, someone who is white is probably going to vote more conservatively because those are reinforcing cleavages. Those going to church tend to be more conservative. Those living in rural areas tend to be more conservative. Those that are white tend to be more conservative. Those are reinforcing cleavages. Those different demographic groups that we're talking about there tend to reinforce each other in terms of conservative, conservative, conservative. Now, a cross-cutting cleavage would be to look at someone in an urban area and then look at them in terms of that urban area and maybe they are white and they're in an urban area and they are well off, but they to have less of an education as a result of this. These are cross-cutting cleavages because their church-going status, their urban center, they kind of cut across each other. I can't really tell how that person's going to vote. I know that they are wealthy, but I know that they don't have a high education. So again, those are cutting across each other. Wealthier people tend to vote more conservatively, but those that don't have as much of an education can tend to vote more liberally as a result of that. So these are cross-cutting cleavages in terms of they don't necessarily match in terms of being able to make an easy determination about how they're going to vote. A white Protestant male, as I mentioned, very reinforcing. A black Protestant female, well, we know females and blacks tend to vote more liberally, but Protestants tend to vote more conservatively. So we're not sure how she's going to vote as a result of that. That's a cross-cutting cleavage, and those are harder for political scientists and pollsters to figure out how they're actually going to vote in that cross-cutting setting. They tend to be more wild cards. Now we can also add up the number of conservatives versus liberals based on those generalizations and have a leaning direction. But again, that's not a surefire way that they're going to vote in that direction. Geography also matters here too. Somebody who lives in an urban area versus someone who lives in a rural area. Someone who lives in the South versus in the North or in the West, but in an urban area in the South. Atlanta, for instance, living in Atlanta in the South, cross-cutting cleavage. Just because they're living in the South doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be conservative, as we saw with the state of Georgia in the 2020 election. And so just because people live in California doesn't necessarily mean they're going to vote liberally. They may live in a rural area of California. So geography, that region tends to vote more liberally, but their rural status may weigh out there in terms of them voting more conservatively. So there are some cross-cutting cleavages here that we see as well. And de Tocqueville noticed this way back in the 1830s when he wrote Democracy in America. He was actually coming to America not to study democracy, but to study our penal institutions, to study our penitentiary system, and actually kind of stumbled on the idea of democracy here and why it was so successful. Things like the various opportunities that were available to people to get a leg up and acquire land, make a living, and basically make a way for themselves. All of these things contributed to the success of democracy here, and the abundance of land really helped with that. And he talked about why American democracy was so successful and could be successful here as a result of all of the things that they had going for them in terms of the land of opportunity, if you will. So we see a lot of this throughout the South's history and demographics in terms of that some of those characteristics that de Tocqueville talked about here in terms of why democracy thrived. We do see a lot of Civil War era actions still taking place here in the South, and it impacts their demographics. This is starting to change. We saw that with Georgia and Arizona. But for the most part, in terms of what is considered the South, which many seem to believe more of the redder states that you see here, tend to be more the designated southern areas. They are very religious. They are very conservative. Some of these areas are part of the Bible Belt, basically coming through the Midwest, looking at a lot of these Midwestern states that you see here, more the Bible Belt. And then you have the Sun Belt, as we talked about before, this idea of the southern tier of the South, in terms of the deep South states that we see here. They have had a lot of struggles with the civil rights movement, with Jim Crow era laws, black codes, the civil rights integration of schools, as well as the implementation of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, fair housing in 1968. All of these have really had an impact and had a lot of pushback from elected officials and leaders in the South. As far as its demographics, but tends to be very conservative, again, very religious in that nature, and we can see why we've seen changes over time in terms of Democrats losing areas of the South. We've seen that since, as I mentioned, that civil rights movement significantly, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 really having an impact on and a decline. Lyndon Johnson said when he expressed his support for it, being a Southern Democrat himself, said we've lost the South for a generation. Well, he was right but wrong. Didn't lose them for a generation, as Michael Beschloss has said. They basically lost the South for 3 generations at least, and are just starting to win states back, like Georgia and, as we mentioned, Arizona. And that has been significant in terms of its slow, gradual change. But it was a much more impactful thing that even Lyndon Johnson didn't realize, in terms of how long the South would be in Republican control as a result of what they saw there. Now, in the state houses, we definitely see that there's a lot more in terms of the Republican share of legislators here in the House and Senate, and that has grown over time. There is a significant unified government in a lot of cases. There are only handfuls of Democrats that have gubernatorial standings in the southern states, and most of those in the South, most of the legislatures are in the hands of Republicans. And we have seen some of the voting rights issues, legislation that's been proposed since the 2020 election has been in the South, and as a result of what we've seen here. Now, why is that the case? Well, because 66% of people voted across the country, and significantly in places like Arizona and Georgia, where because of the pandemic, the bar was lowered in terms of being able to vote by mail, not having to have a reason to vote by mail, or absentee, and that really kind of changed the game in terms of them being able to people being able to vote there. For various reasons. Now, we see this in 2012, and you can watch the map here. I think it's rather indicative of what we've seen. This was the 2012 election. This was Obama's re-election campaign by county, the red being conservative, voting for Mitt Romney, the blue being liberal, voting for, or more progressive, voting for the Obama Biden ticket. In 2016, we would see this very bifurcated with the election of President Trump. I'm going to go back for a second to 2012 just so you can see the differences in terms of more conservative-leaning counties, and thus winning the Electoral College, especially in states where you see Wisconsin really changing a lot more red in Wisconsin in 2016. The same is true of Michigan and even Pennsylvania. Now, fast forward to 2020. So here's the 2016 map, and here's the 2020 map. I'm going to go back to that again. And we can see still a lot of red, but more blue in places where a little bit to tip the scales in those Wisconsins, in Michigan and Pennsylvania, as well as much more blue in Georgia and Arizona in terms of what we saw there, really having an impact on those races. And that is significant because, again, demographics tell us that as the demographics are changing, we're also seeing some differences in terms of party sway in some of those states that were very ruby red and are now becoming more purple in that regard. And we mentioned the South, or the Bible Belt, being in this southern part of the Sun Belt, which is kind of the lower portion of the United States. The Bible Belt a little broader here than I mentioned. It was kind of more Midwest, what I was referring to, but it does hit the Deep South quite a bit in terms of the Bible Belt. Who is this going to help demographically in terms of parties? Well, it's going to help conservatives. And in terms of regional differences, the Sun Belt, who has it helped up to this point? Definitely conservatives. In terms of the Northeast, the Rust Belt up here near the Great Lakes states, the Mid-Atlantic, much more progressive, much more liberal in nature. Again, with some exceptions, but for the most part, we've seen that time and again. Which party is being helped by those? Well, in the South, it is helping Republicans. In the North, helping Democrats. In the Northwest, helping Democrats. In the north central states and the Great Lakes states, helping Republicans. We saw Wisconsin in 2016. The legislature changed. The governor's race changed in 2018. But we saw a lot of changes there as a result of regional differences that were happening. And what we see here in terms of changes, I mentioned the Rust Belt, those Great Lakes states. Having an impact, losing representation. The likelihood is that Ohio is going to lose yet another one in this upcoming census. That is going to be significant because Ohio is becoming more and more ruby red, while Pennsylvania may be purple, and aspects of western Pennsylvania more red than the green, or excuse me, the blue parts of the eastern part of Pennsylvania, but that is definitely helping conservatives in losing those seats, because the seats that are disappearing are being redistricted out. A great example of this is the Democratic. He ran for Speaker against Nancy Pelosi last time. Democrats gained control of the House of Representatives, and he's likely to lose his seat out of Cleveland in the redistricting of the census in 2022. So to be continued. We'll see what happens there, but that could be significant. He may run for Senate though there too. We see that's a possibility as well. And then population changes, as I mentioned, can have an impact in terms of what states are going to pick up seats, what states are going to lose seats, and how is that going to have an impact. Population obviously does. It affects reapportionment. It affects redistricting. We see states like Maryland probably not going to have any change, but states like Texas and Florida definitely going to pick up some. We see the Rust Belt states probably going to lose seats, and Texas and Florida really going to pick those up. So, and then in terms of Illinois may even lose more than a seat, maybe even more than that. So who knows? But until we get the census data, that's the best projections in terms of what's going on there. Now, in the last electoral vote changes, we saw in 2010, we saw Texas gain 4. That means they gained almost to the tune of 4 million people essentially moving in over the last 10 years. 4 million people moving into the state. I mean, that's huge, significant difference. And Ohio lost 2 in the 2010 census. Probably going to lose at least 1 in the 2020 census. But that is going to have an impact on demographics. Who's in charge of redrawing those districts? Well, in Texas and Florida, it's Republicans. In Georgia right now, it's Republicans. In South Carolina, it's Republicans. So they're going to draw those districts to favor Republicans. And so they may be picking up some seats there as well. Minority Leader in the House of Representatives has basically said that it is likely that Republicans will take over the House of Representatives in the 2022 election. Now, to be continued, we'll see how that plays out. But just based on redistricting and some of those the reapportionment and redistricting aspect, they really could, if they could pick up 5, 6, 7, 8 seats that were otherwise Democrats before, they could really they could tip the scales, especially when it's that close. So we will see. We will see what happens there. But that is a likely possibility in terms of what Kevin McCarthy was talking about there. Some regional differences here. As I mentioned, you may see in urban centers more Democrats, where in more rural areas you may see more Republicans. We know that in urban areas they tend to be more liberal. Rural areas tend to be more conservative. Suburban voters are kind of a mix. They swing. They're those moderate voters that we talked about in downstairs rational choice. They swing to the left or swing to the right in elections and can have an impact on whether Democrats or Republicans win. In terms of the South, we know that they are more conservative. The Midwest, again, as I mentioned, can swing, tend to be conservative, other than in places like Wisconsin, Illinois, Minnesota, Michigan. Otherwise, pretty conservative in the Midwest, in the Plains states as well. And then you get to the Northwest or Northeast, they tend to be more liberal, more progressive in nature. In terms of race and ethnicity in voting, we see that whites, as we mentioned, tend to vote more conservatively. Non-Hispanic whites would tend to vote more conservatively, as we see here. Blacks tend to vote more Democratic, and Hispanics, again, not a monolith, but we know that Hispanics, for the most part, will vote more Democratic, except for Cuban Americans that tend to vote more conservatively. So we kind of see how that breaks down. And then looking at some of the other data, and again, there's lots of data out there to crunch, but men vote more conservatively than women. Younger voters in this poll tended to vote more democratically than older voters that tend to vote more conservatively. We see those with college educations tend to vote more liberally than those without college. And then the wealthier tend to vote more conservatively versus the more moderate income and lower income that vote more liberally. And we see kind of how that breaks down. So again, we could crunch numbers all day, 6 ways to Sunday, but we can see time and again that the turnout, we kind of talked about this in the last chapter, but the turnout is definitely higher in presidential elections than in midterms. And again, this data just reinforces that in terms of who's voting and supporting whom. In terms of these races, we can see the peaks are in the presidential years in which there are presidential elections. The valleys are in those midterm elections. Always have fewer voters turning out in those midterm elections than in presidential years. People just aren't paying as much attention. They don't see the need to vote. Do we really need to turn out for this? Is this really that important? That's a lot of what we see there. Now, breaking down the last two elections, the data on the left is the 2016 election. The data on the right is the 2020 election. And we can see here that whites tended to vote more for Trump in both elections. We saw blacks tended to vote more liberally, more for Biden and for Clinton in both of those races. We see the Hispanic vote also doing the same, voting more liberally for Clinton and for Biden in those races. Again, they don't break that down into Cuban Americans, but we do know Cuban Americans tend to vote more conservatively than other Hispanic in the Latinx community. Asians tend to vote more liberally than conservatively in terms of what we see here. And then other races we saw in the 2016 race voted more for Clinton, and they also voted more for Biden in that breakdown. So you're going to ask the question, well, how is that then that Clinton lost, considering she won so many of these demographic groups? Because remember, the data broke down in terms of a few states with just a few thousand votes that really tipped the scales. And that was all that Donald Trump needed in order to win over those states. Biden looked at that in the 2020 election and said, well, can we flip them back in our direction? And was able to do that with Wisconsin, with Pennsylvania, with Michigan, as well as Arizona and Georgia. And that was enough to tip the scales in the other direction. So we see that time and time again. Again, we're going to make some generalizations here, but let's talk for a second about race, ethnicity, religion, and age. African Americans have a very strong voting pattern, probably the strongest of any demographic group. They do vote, but they don't vote as much as whites, but they do tend to vote Democratic 90% of the time. They don't turn out as much as white voters do, as I mentioned. And there is a lot of correlation here, a lot of reinforcing cleavage when it comes to education and income levels. So if they are higher educated, they tend to vote more liberally. If they're lower educated, more conservatively. If they are higher income, they tend to vote more conservatively. If they're lower income, tend to vote more liberally. And President Obama amazingly got 95% of that African American vote, which was huge, and understandably so. He was the first African American to be elected president, so you can understand the significance there in terms of how that played out. But that is a huge margin in terms of winning 95% of a demographic group like that. Now let's talk about Hispanics. Again, I said less monolithic for sure. We know Cuban Americans tend to vote more conservatively. But we can see that the Latinx community tends to vote more liberally or more progressive, more for Democrats across the board, and the Cuban Americans more conservative, usually because of the Castro and the Cuban influences there. But President Obama in 2008 got nearly 67% of the Hispanic vote. They are called the sleeping giant of politics because we could see in Florida is a great example of this. In 2020, Florida, the Hispanic vote in Florida moved away from Biden and towards Donald Trump. For a number of reasons, immigration being one of them, but that was significant, and it put Florida in the Trump column for the 2020 election. It did so in 2016 as well. But that is significant there because, again, a significant movement, and did the same in Texas, by the way, in 2020. In terms of the Texas vote, swung to Trump. They thought it was going to be much closer. For a while there, it was kind of down to the wire. But then in many of those Latinx communities, they tended to move towards Trump, and that was enough to put him over into the win column for Texas. So again, not monolithic by any means in terms of those stratifications that we're just starting to see and be able to break that down in terms of sub-stratified groups. Asian Americans also not monolithic. We see Japanese Americans more democratic than others and with other backgrounds. They do tend to have higher income and higher education levels than other minority groups, and that also ties into their higher level of political participation. Much higher internal efficacy here, being able to know and understand and paying attention to politics and taking part in that political process. So we see a lot of that taking shape here as well. Let's go to religion. Religion is an important aspect here. We see that Jewish people and Catholics tend to vote more Democratic, where Protestants tend to vote more conservatively, especially the fundamentalists or evangelicals tend to vote more conservatively or more Republican in that regard. We had the first Catholic candidate in Al Smith, who did not win in 1928, JFK in 1960, and then Joe Biden, who won, who was Roman Catholic and won in 2020. Notice that Jewish people vote 90% of the time, and those with no affiliation 60% of the time, in terms of no religious affiliation in those categories. But we do tend to see a lot of those outside of the Protestant, the evangelical group, tend to be more democratic in those religious areas outside, trying to be more religiously tolerant, and tend to vote for more liberal candidates than conservative ones. By gender, we have seen this time and again, the gender gap that continues here. A lot of data on gender, but we know women tend to vote more liberally. Men vote more conservatively, and there's definitely a gap there in terms of, and you can see this in some of the data that's playing out here. You can pause it to go into more detail because we've got a lot of data on gender in those terms. Here's the 2020 race in terms of how that broke down Biden versus Trump. Notice that the males, 53 to 45, voted for Trump versus 57 to 42 voted females voted for Biden. So it's pretty significant in terms of the gap that we see here. And very similarly, we saw that in 2016 with the breakdown in Trump versus Clinton in that regard. Biden definitely won more women this time around than Clinton did, and also won more men in this go around as well. So we see a lot of that breaking down as well. Sexual orientation and gender roles here. So we can see that when it comes to sexual orientation, the LGBT community tends to vote more Democratic. The more liberal in nature. The Democratic Party tends to be more accommodating and supportive of LGBT issues than we have seen. President Obama signing the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and not supporting DOMA, which was a Democratic signed president that signed that. Bill Clinton actually did. But LGBT community tends to be more liberal than conservative in that regard. Some other demographic factors that we see here. Obviously, the family is important. And that structure has been changing. That has an impact in terms of if we have divorced parents, we can see, again, they may break along different lines by region or geography or urban versus rural. But in a lot of cases, if it's a traditional family and a traditional community, they may be more conservative than a divorced family. Education, again, higher education is going to participate more and usually going to be more liberal than conservative. Wealth, again, higher income, more conservative than liberal. And we're not really in the social class category. I would say it's more socioeconomic status. It's more wealth and income that we see there. But we do know with age, older voters tend to be more conservative. And younger, more liberal in nature. Again, I mentioned the family status. Those that were not married tended to vote more for Biden than those who were married. And then you can see the breakdown there by marital status. Unmarried men and women both voted for Biden, where married men and married women tended to vote for Trump. I thought that was interesting because a lot of times we've heard about married women voting more liberally, but they didn't in this race. They actually voted more conservatively with a 4-point margin. And then parents with children, women with children tended to vote more Democratic or more liberal versus men with children that voted more conservatively. And then those without kids, again, they broke down along gender lines. Women with no children voted for Biden versus men with no children voted for Trump along those lines. Education, as we mentioned, in terms of how that breaks down, those with higher educations tend to vote more liberally, and those without education or without higher degrees tend to vote more conservatively in that regard. And we see that time and again playing out here in terms of how those votes. And you can pause the video here and look at more of the data, but this is just basically underscoring those particular points on education, that the higher level of information that you have, the more likely they are to vote. And obviously not always, but again, we're generalizing. But the idea is those with higher education and degrees tend to support the more liberal candidate than conservative one. I think there's a couple of exceptions to that here in terms of what we see, but for the most part, that generalization usually plays out. Social class, as I mentioned, it's more socioeconomic status, more based on wealth in terms of that. But you can also see the impact that this has on political attitudes from a race and ethnicity point of view. That income earners are very, the wealth divide is very broken down based on white versus race or ethnicities that is non-white. And that is significant here as well, because that does impact how they vote and how people vote along those lines. When they're wealthier or poorer, that does have an impact on, again, wealthier tend to vote more conservatively, and the lower income tend to vote more liberally in that regard. And we see that playing out here in this election. Those with lower incomes tended to vote more for Biden. Those with higher incomes tended to vote more for Trump. And that age range also breaks down similarly. Those that were older voted more conservatively. Those that were younger voted more democratically. So we can see a lot of this playing out from the 2020 election data, and it really does underscore a lot of the demographics that we're talking about here. And again, this is more of the same. Looking at age, again, we've seen the percentage of the population that's growing, that's aging is growing, and we see this time again, they tend to be more conservative. There are some swing independent and moderate voters, but for the most part, they tend to be more conservative the older they get, and the younger ones tend to be more liberal or leaning in that direction. In terms of what we see there. We saw this in the last election in terms of voters. Notice as they age, they are voting more conservatively. The younger voters are voting more liberally. And that played out as well in this election, as we saw those two different groups. Those that were younger, look at that. In the 18 to 24 age category, Biden won that 18 to 24 demographic group by nearly 35 points, 34 points there between Biden and Trump, 65 to 31. Now, flip that when it comes down to those 65 and over. Trump won the 65 and over category 52 to 47, a much closer spread, but still they're voting more conservatively in that camp. And we see that time and time again in terms of how that's breaking down pretty significantly here in terms of those differences. So the older voters tend to vote more conservatively, younger voters more liberally, and that continues to play out in all of the data that we see here. All right, let's shift gears now and look at party ID. Obviously, those that affiliate with a party are going to be more likely to vote conservatively or liberally based on their party. So if you are identifying as a Republican, you're going to support a conservative viewpoint. And likewise, if you are associated with the Democratic Party, you're going to vote more liberally in that regard. And I think that's pretty common sense. That's probably the easiest one to gather in terms of how people will vote. Now, notice the top 1% versus the bottom 99. Again, those with higher wealth are going to vote more conservatively. Those with less wealth going to vote more liberally in that nature. So what brings us all together? Well, things like democratic values. Again, we talked about this before, part of our political culture, right? We value freedom, we value equality, we value liberty. Who doesn't value those things? Economic opportunity, it unifies Americans in terms of bringing us together here. Also, our work ethic, the American dream, the idea of being able to find that American dream, and part of those values, especially after World War II, where that really started to take off. People wanted a house with a picket fence and 2.2 kids and a dog and a cat and maybe even a tractor or whatever. And we see this time and time again. These are the things that bring us together. These are the things that bring us together as Americans, right? But one of the things that we come back to here from the last chapter is really how this breaks down among demographics. And we can see that Democratic voters or liberal voters or progressives, whatever you want to call them, tend to be younger. They're more racially diverse. They are women. They are LGBTQ members of the LGBTQ community. More secular in nature, can be of the Jewish or Muslim religion. They usually have less than high school or a postgraduate education, either one or the other, usually not as much in between. They are urban and more city dwellers, and they usually earn less than $50,000. Now, again, those are more, and again, we're generalizing, so that doesn't mean every person who falls into these categories is going to fall into this particular, liberal ideology. But the idea is that conservatives would be middle-aged or older. They're white, usually men, very evangelical or Christian in their Protestant beliefs. They are wealthy. They are from the South or the Midwest. Again, that Bible Belt we talked about earlier, very rural, possibly white-collar, and definitely veterans tend to vote more for conservatives in that regard. So that really is what breaks it down in terms of trying to address those key points. I hope you found this overview helpful with this chapter, and we will be back with the top 12 highlights on demographics, and looking forward to the next couple of chapters as we look at social and economic policy. So stay tuned, and we'll see you soon.